So we last learned about the West expansion era when we were expanding west, but at the same time we were industrializing in the east, in the East Coast, and we call that the Gilded Age, the time period in which we were industrializing. And then I told you that gilded means, something that looks really nice on the outside, but the inside is poor quality, right? And that's what was used to describe the US. Well, the progressive era, the era of progress in which we try to improve all those, those issues with our society, that time period follows right after. So the late 1800s, 1890s, the early 1900s, that's the progressive era. So, like I said, these were all the problems that were caused by industrialization. Poor living conditions, homelessness, child labor, overcrowding, just tons of poverty, unsafe, unsanitary working conditions. Things were unsafe for consumers and workers, of course. Alcoholism was a problem, corruption was a problem, women didn't have rights, tons of problems, right? So we fixed all those problems, and it begins with muckrakers. Muckrakers were journalists that exposed all the problems with society by writing about them. They wrote about everything that was wrong. That way we can read about it. That way the government can read about all those problems and pass laws to fix those problems. So they're called muckrakers because they're trying to rake up the muck. They're trying to clean up the muck with society by exposing them. All right, so we learned about Upton Sinclair being one of the main muckrakers at the time because he exposed the meatpacking industry. Remember, he went undercover and he wrote about how bad it was. And then that prompted the government to pass two laws, the Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, to protect consumers. And then here are some other muckrakers. Jacob Riis, his books were about poverty in the city. Ida Tarbell focused on Rockefeller and his corruption. Lincoln Stevens, government corruption in cities. This one was about railroad companies. Ida B. Wells talked about lynching and how that needs to be gone ASAP. So those were all muckrakers, right? And then we have some progressive era presidents, some presidents during this time period that passed laws to address those problems. So I remember Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, he came up with the Square Deal plan, which was his plan to be equal and fair with everyone, just like a square. So he was going to get rid of trusts, which are monopolies, try to tackle big businesses that are being unfair with consumers and customers. And he was a huge conservationist. It was all about trying to preserve our country's best scenery areas, and by setting aside land, large tracts of land. And so he started like the national parks. William Howard Taft is a president who came right after. Remember, they were best friends. And he didn't do very good. He wasn't very progressive during his 4 years, his first 4 years. So Theodore Roosevelt comes back and they fight over trying to become president. Theodore Roosevelt, unfortunately, has to create a new political party, the Bull Moose Party, and they end up splitting votes because they have the same fan base. So they split votes. And because of that, neither one wins. And Woodrow Wilson wins and becomes the next president. So Woodrow Wilson was very, very progressive. He passed all these laws plus hundreds more. These are just the main ones that we have to learn for the STAAR. But he passed the Clayton Antitrust Act, which replaced the Sherman Antitrust Act and actually made it illegal to have nationwide monopolies. He added on to the National Park Service and designated all these tracts of land for just, it was going to be considered government land, which means people can't buy it, they can't tamper with it. So that's important to know. He passed the 16th Amendment, which is the income tax amendment, allows the government to tax our incomes, but then we get a lot of our taxes back during income tax season. 17th Amendment, which we wanted to be able to choose our senators. That was something new. And then the 18th Amendment, which started with the temperance movement, that led to alcohol being illegal. Now we know there's alcohol still around, because this amendment didn't work. It lasted 13 years, but then organized crime increased by 300%. Everybody was drinking even more than before. So they just brought alcohol back. And then women's rights, they get the right to vote. They get suffrage, which, like I said, is the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony was the leader of the women's suffrage movement for a very long time. And in 1919, women get the right to vote. So women were the ones who pushed for the 18th Amendment to get rid of alcohol because, you know, their spouses were big, you know, drinkers and had heavy tempers. And then they get this right after. And it's all because of their support during World War I with the war efforts, right? And then one more thing to talk about that also is part of the progressive era, labor unions. Workers had been taken advantage of for a very long time because of the laissez-faire economy that we had. So workers start to come together, labor workers unionizing, uniting to fight for better pay, shorter work hours, get rid of child labor, and other types of things. One of the biggest labor unions of the time was the AFL. It's actually still around today, the American Federation of Labor, and the president was Samuel Gompers. And one of the things that they were known for, and even till this day, is going on strike to get what you want. It is an effective method of, you know, getting what you want. So that is for the progressive era. And now I'm going to move on to a new topic, which is the next era. And they actually kind of overlap. A lot of these eras overlap. They're just kind of grouped with similar characteristics. Julia, you paying attention? All right, so imperialism. What is imperialism? That is when the United States, that means expansionism. When you're expanding your territory, expanding your influence. And in the 1800s, late 1800s, we went through this wave of imperialism where not just the United States, but all countries were trying to compete for land and influence and domination around the world. So yes, expansionism. We've seen this before. You may not be very familiar with what this stands for, but you will at the end of the PowerPoint when I show it to you again, okay? So remember, before we started to expand, we were first all about isolationism, keeping to ourselves. We didn't want to expand our territory. We didn't want to get involved with other countries. We were focusing on ourselves, right? So isolationism and imperialism are complete opposites, okay? But we broke the isolationism period around this time, and we realized that it is important to be imperialistic. First of all, economically, it made sense. We wanted markets around the world. We wanted to start getting American goods all over the place and using other countries for cheap labor and natural resources also. So China was one of the main ones that we were imperialistic with. There are other political factors. We just wanted to have an empire. We wanted to have naval bases around the world. If we're going to be trading, doing business with other countries, then we need to have our Navy all over the world for quick access to any type of conflict that can happen. Cultural factors. We believe that we were the superior culture, that we were probably the best, country that had all the best ideals, and we wanted to spread our culture. We wanted to spread Christianity. We wanted to spread democracy and other political freedoms around the world. So that was another thing that motivated us to just kind of getting outside of our isolated bubble. Alfred T. Mahan, he's super important. He was a really big supporter of imperialism. And he was an admiral. He wrote this book about how it's important to be imperialistic. And if you're going to do that, you need to have a powerful Navy to compete with other countries who are also imperialistic. We got Hawaii in 1898. That was easy. That was just something that they did, and it led to annexation. And, then we were able to put a naval base, our largest naval base at the time, in Hawaii, out there in the middle of nowhere. It was supposed to be hidden. Later on, it gets bombed during World War II. Remember when we learned about the Monroe Doctrine? That was a warning to European countries that they must stay out of the Western Hemisphere, which is out of the Americas. Well, we ended up fighting a country for that, which we fought Spain in the Spanish-American War. And it was within 1 year. It only lasted 4 months. It was not even that long. It was an easy win for us. This is where Theodore Roosevelt gets his name, where he becomes famous. So some of the causes of the Spanish-American War, Cubans, they were still under Spanish control. There was still slavery. They needed our help. We came to their aid. Yellow journalism, American journalists were just, they were up in everyone's business, the Spanish-American War, exposing everything, rallying Americans up, exaggerating stories, and it really encouraged us to fight Spain for different reasons. The De Lome letter, it was an insult on our president, President McKinley, it was a letter from the Spanish ambassador to the King of Spain, and basically it really upset us, and it added fuel to the fire because of the tensions. And then there was an explosion of the USS Maine that happened. It was our ship, USS Maine, in Cuba, and it exploded. And, American journalists blamed the Spanish. It was all over the newspapers, and it really encouraged us to go to war. So those were all the causes. And then war happens. Theodore Roosevelt, like I said, becomes famous. He was a Rough Rider. He was a general in the military, or he was a high-ranking leader in the military. And he recruits a whole bunch of volunteers from Texas and other places, and they become very victorious, especially at the Battle of San Juan Hill. Just make sure you know that, Battle of San Juan Hill. And like I said, the war was over within 4 months. We fought it in Cuba, we fought it in the Philippines, and that was it. So after the war was over, Cuba gets its independence, but they have to be a protectorate of the United States, meaning we must, I don't want to say control it, but it kind of was like we were controlling Cuba. But and then Puerto Rico, Philippines, and Guam were ceded to the United States. They all became colonies or territories of the United States. After the war was over, trade increased with all these new colonies that we acquired. That's an important thing. And we become a world power because now we have an empire overseas. And we fought another country that was a world power. So 1898 is important for us becoming a world power, fighting the Spanish-American War and getting Hawaii. So there's two significant things to the year 1898. So 1898, us expanding, and these are the colonies that we got, or the territories we got during that time. China and the open door policy. So China, like I said, we were trading with China. We put markets in China at this time. And this was during a time when everybody saw that China was valuable. Everybody wanted to do business with China. Everybody was fighting over China. And we came up with this really cool open door policy where China agreed and other countries agreed that we would all split China evenly. We would all do trade, business with them. And it was a good thing because that really put us on the map for being able to make diplomatic decisions, with other countries. So Panama, that's another topic. Remember, we're talking about how we were involved around the world. So Panama, remember there was a need for a shortcut through, Central America, Latin America, because we used to have to go all the way around South America to get from one side of the ocean to the other, to get to China, in other words. So we built this shortcut. It took about 8 years. We chose Panama because Panama is the most narrow part of the hemisphere. And there was already a lake there, so it wasn't that big of an issue. Teddy Roosevelt is the one who initiated the Panama Canal, so that is something that you have to know about Teddy Roosevelt. And we mentioned that there were a lot of problems, a lot of obstacles to building the Panama Canal, right? Mountainous, rainforest climate, uneven water levels, tons of mosquitoes that had diseases that were killing the workers. And then it was expensive. It was extremely expensive, but we got our money back in the end because we were able to charge a toll. And we had this canal all the way up until, well, you guys should know this because you just learned it in the Ed puzzle, all the way up until, good, up until December 31st, 1999. Yeah, basically, yeah. We just kind of finished off the century with it, and then, yeah, we turned it over to Panama without any compensation. Isn't that crazy? But we had gotten a lot of money back, so it was no big deal, like through the tolls. All right, so the Monroe Doctrine, a new topic. Now, remember, well, actually, I just mentioned the Monroe Doctrine. It said that Europeans have to stay out of the Americas. Now, that was in 1823. In 1904, we add on to the Monroe Doctrine and we say, not only do we not want you over here trying to claim land, trying to control developing countries like Latin American countries, we are willing to use military force to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. And we're going to use our military, which the big stick is a metaphor for our Navy, which was our pride and joy, the Great White Fleet at the time. This is Theodore Roosevelt's policy. So you can't mess with Theodore Roosevelt. He's willing to fight you. He's willing to threaten and use, like I said, military force to get what he wants. All right, so that's all imperialism. And I need to mention one more thing that goes with imperialism. One more topic, and that's World War I, because this is how we break isolationism. We're going to take a break in a little bit. I just need to kind of go through this really fast. Sometimes my breaks last too long, and then I regret it. So let me just knock this out. All right, give me a second. Let me take a sip of water and coffee. Ow. Okay, let's see. Let me share the right screen. All right, World War I. This is extremely important. You will be tested over world wars. It's a big part of U.S. history, right? So I don't know what they're going to test you on. So let's just make sure we have the main ideas of the war. I'm going to skip a lot of stuff of World War I and just kind of hit things that I've always seen on the STAAR exam, okay? So first of all, be familiar with the years. That's another important date, 1914 to 1918. But we don't join, the U.S. doesn't join until 1917, and then the war is over the following year. So remember the main causes of World War I? Militarism, right? Building up your military and your navy and weapons. Alliances, countries teaming up, right? Nationalism. Oh, I skipped one. Has to be in order. Oh, because it's mania. Okay. Imperialism, which is countries expanding, fighting for territory around the world dominance. And nationalism, the fact that the countries thought were so patriotic, so prideful, it was causing tensions because they're all bordering countries in Europe, right? And then there was a spark, something that sparked the war, and it was the assassination of an archduke that had an alliance with Germany, and that is how war begins, once this person gets assassinated. So remember, our policy at the beginning of the war, when we found out about it going on in Europe, we were like, we're neutral, we're not picking a side, we're isolated, we're keeping to ourselves. I'm sorry, we can't get involved. This is not our war, it's your war. But then we end up getting in, like I said, a few years later, right? Because of some events. So one, Germany was unstoppable. They were the only one that had a U-boat, a submarine. They were using it to their advantage. They were very careless, irresponsible. A lot of people were dying just because they were shooting any ships down. And we basically chose a side and we're like, we need to stop Germany, right? And then because of their unrestricted submarine warfare, they sink a ship, a British ship that had Americans on there, and that really upset us, even though we had weapons underneath them. We really were helping the British out. But they didn't know that, or maybe they did. And then the Zimmerman telegram, this was our final draw. They sent a letter to Germany. Germany sent a letter to Mexico trying to encourage them to attack the United States. And then we knew where their intentions were at. So we were like, okay, now we have to get involved, right? So this is 1917, and this is the year we joined. So those are all the reasons why we get in. And whenever we go through a major war, everything changes. For the first time, we used propaganda in this war to try to get Americans to be supportive with the war effort, and it worked. All right, so propaganda, there are different types of propaganda. First of all, the government was rationing items, putting limits on what we can buy, and there were all these posters, these propaganda posters, to just get Americans to just support it, go along with it. We're trying to get Americans to grow their own gardens because crops were being rationed. We're getting Americans to buy war bonds, giving a loan to the government, which would be given back. Many Americans did it. Unemployment decreased, which means everybody was working. A lot of people had jobs. Women were working. African Americans were working, while most men were away fighting. Now, this was the first war we had a draft. So that's a Selective Service Act. You've been selected to serve your country. We've had one during World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War, which you got to know that. And of course, on the STAAR, they don't say draft, they say Selective Service Act. So just make sure you're familiar with that. And you can tell, look at the year 1917, the year that we joined. We had new types of military technologies, mainly because of industrialization. We just went through this revolution worldwide, right? And also, countries were building up their weapons. So we had airplanes, submarines, which are U-boats, machine guns, poison, mustard gas, trench warfare, tanks. All these things were used for the first time in a war, and it caused massive casualties, a lot of deaths, more deaths than any other wars before in that short time period. Remember I mentioned no man's land? That was a land in between dug up trenches, in which was all barbed up, trapped. And that usually caused stalemates in this war, where stalemate is where nobody's really making any progress. It's just a long period of no fighting. And then when we joined the war, the soldiers that were drafted and sent to the front lines, they were called the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, led by John J. Pershing. The Battle of Argonne Force is the only one you have to know for World War I. It was the turning point battle. We defeated the Axis powers, not the Axis, the Central Powers. Axis is World War II. But we defeat the Central Powers, and then after that, the war ends the same year, 1918. Alvin York, he received the Medal of Honor for bravery. And then the Treaty of Versailles, the famous Treaty of Versailles that was signed the following year, ended the war, punished Germany severely, and it is the main cause of World War II. All right, so this, World War I caused World War II mainly because of this treaty. So what were Germany's punishments? Land taken away, their entire empire. They could not have a military or a navy. They had to take full blame of the war, which is basically all the other ones. And they had to pay war reparations. They had to pay payments, make payments to the Allies for the damages that they caused in the form of $33 billion. And when Hitler rises to power, he breaks this treaty in every single way. And those were his intentions. And that's why it's a cause. President Woodrow Wilson, our president at the time, he came up with, 14 ideas for world peace. But the main one that you have to know is number 14, the League of Nations. It was an organization of countries that would come together and they would promise to be peaceful. It ended up not working out. We didn't join, unfortunately, because it couldn't get approved by Congress. But today it's called the United Nations. So that was his idea that turned out to work in the long run. But we didn't join the League of Nations, and we didn't sign the Treaty of Versailles because it seemed like an alliance. And we didn't want Germany to want to have revenge on us. And we just wanted to go back to isolationism, just going back to just keeping to ourselves and not having any type of connection with European countries because they're very unstable. They're always at war with each other. And one more time, remember, women were so supportive. They get the 19th Amendment suffrage, right? The right to vote in 1919. So that is what I wanted to talk about. So what I'm going to do is give you, let's go ahead and look at this right here. Let me see. So if you've been studying your book, then you've already, like, this all should be familiar. It takes a while to load. Then we've covered, if we look back at this timeline, we did Gilded Age and westward expansion. They're grouped together last Thursday. And then the Progressive Era, we just did right now, well, a little while ago, and imperialism and World War I. So we'll look at some questions. I'll give you a little bit of practice or an opportunity to practice. And then we'll look at Roaring '20s and the Great Depression. And then I'll see if I can go over the dates with you guys. Okay. So what I want you, so we basically covered all the way up into right here, this page. Page 11. No, page 12. Now you should be reading, reviewing, memorizing, I don't know, this right here. If you don't want to go back and look at the PowerPoints, then this is just kind of a shortened review for you of like the main ideas that I just kind of covered. Now I skipped some stuff because, like I said, it's all important, but if it's something that doesn't come out a lot on the STAAR, then I kind of skipped it because I was like, well, there's other things that I need to focus on and I'm limited on time. So yeah, just make sure you go through all this. Like if you don't know the Zimmerman telegram, if you don't know the Battle of Argonne Forest, if you don't know the League of Nations, Treaty of Versailles, make sure to read this because it's all here. All right, so you should be doing this. This is just like practice, like quizzing yourself. I've already told you that it's not for a grade, it's good practice for you. I mean, if you want to know these topics, this is how you're forced to learn because you're really trying to figure out what are the descriptions that go with these terms, and then you can go and look them up. So that's a good way. And then you have an answer key. I uploaded it, so you can check. I think I uploaded it. I don't know. Now that I think about it. So Progressive Era, that's what we talked about. Muckrakers, right? The journalists that expose problems to society. Upton Sinclair. I think we already learned Jane Addams. You should know what a monopoly is. Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller. This is the same one. This one's all imperialism. The Spanish-American War specifically, right? Yellow journalism, DeLome letter, USS Maine, Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, open door policy. And this is the same one. And then this one right here has World War I, included Panama Canal, League of Nations, causes of World War I. That's the same one. And this one has World War I and Roaring '20s. Some of them are repeated, like you might do one quiz and then you go down to the next one and then you're like, you see the same terms. The more you see it, the more likely you are to remember it, okay? So I am going to give you guys, let's see. I guess 7 minutes to kind of practice with this, okay? Of course, this is supposed to be done on your own, but I want to give you a chance to like just take a break from me talking. 7 minutes, and then I'm gonna go back to the Roaring '20s one that I want to cover with you, okay? So starting right now. All right, guys, we are going to look at the Roaring Twenties PowerPoint right now and the Great Depression. And then we'll take another little break. Elizabeth, I saw your message from earlier and I just responded right now. Okay. All right, the Roaring Twenties. This is kind of an easy era, in my opinion. So the Roaring Twenties has a bunch of different names. The Jazz Age, the Harlem Renaissance, the era of Prohibition, right? So much was going on in the 1920s. So here are all the main characteristics that are in this PowerPoint. So we first started off with this Red Scare right after World War I, right? Because World War I ended in 1918, the treaty was signed in 1919. Soldiers come back, and then things were really bad. Like the economy wasn't very stable. There was high inflation, high unemployment. There was rioting and things like that. And we went through this communist scare where we thought our country was going to be overthrown, the government, and we were going to turn communist. So we've had two Red Scares, World War I, right after World War I, and one right after World War II. So because of that, we realized that a lot of the terrorist attacks that were going on around this time were coming from immigrants. So there was a push to start limiting immigration because we had open immigration. Anybody could come to the United States. So the immigrants, and that was with the quota system where they were just putting like a percentage on which immigrants can come from which country. But anybody with radical ideas was being limited. So countries from Eastern Europe, like Russia, because Russia was communist, Southern Europe, and Western Asia, or like another name for Southwest Asia, like the Middle East. So we started to limit immigrants into the United States. All right, so that's a big part of the 1920s. The Scopes monkey trial, that was a trial that really kind of defined the modern way of thinking. It was like modernism versus traditionalism, like the new idea of being open to evolution as a possibility for how life created, or traditionalism that God created mankind. And it was just a huge debate that went on for a while, and that's that. The Harlem Renaissance, the Jazz Age, right? So the Harlem Renaissance is the revival of African American culture. It started with a great migration of African Americans that left the South because of all the discrimination that was in the South, segregation. They moved to the North, to cities where there were jobs. And then from there was this revival of African American culture. A lot of them were talented that moved to the North. So we had the Harlem Renaissance is just the revival of music. Jazz music was something that was started in the 1920s. A famous person is Louis Armstrong. He was a famous jazz player. of the time, originally from New Orleans. That's where jazz originated, but the Harlem Renaissance is in the north, though. And then we have a revival in art, new types of art, very colorful, and it depicts the time, jazz music, prohibition, things like that. And then literature, there was a revival in literature where African Americans were really shining and, just kind of being very motivational for other African Americans to kind of be themselves and show their talents. So, and Langston Hughes is a famous poet, African American poet of the Harlem Renaissance. Prohibition meaning alcohol was prohibited. It wasn't allowed. Now, it was only for, a short time, right? Because alcohol, it just didn't work. So that was the 18th Amendment, like I had mentioned earlier, that prohibited alcohol. And then we know that the women gained the right to vote at the same time. They're passed one year after another. So women are happy that they're getting what they want, and there's a new type of woman of the 1920s, and that's the flapper. A woman who's just very outgoing and free and independent and kind of breaking all the traditional norms of the time, right? Wearing short flappy dresses, wearing makeup and jewelry and dancing and strappy dresses and things like that. Also part of the 1920s, I had mentioned that because alcohol was prohibited, doesn't mean that people stopped drinking alcohol. It actually increased organized crime. It increased bootlegging. So people like Al Capone were around, making alcohol more possible for people. Speakeasies, these were underground nightclubs where alcohol was sold very secretly. And then after 13 years, the noble experiment ends and alcohol comes back. It's legal again, but with the new drinking age, 21, right? So 21, 21st Amendment. Politics. Now, some presidents of the time. We started off the 1920s with President Warren Harding. He dies really early in his presidency, within like 3 years. He doesn't get to finish his first term. He won because of this idea. He was running against Woodrow Wilson, but he won on the idea of let's return to normalcy. Let's go back to isolationism, keep to ourselves. And people liked that idea because they were so traumatized with World War I. And but there was a lot of corruption, a lot of scandals, like the Teapot Dome scandal, which was an oil scandal that happened. And when that happened, many Americans started to lose trust and confidence in their government and didn't want to have anything to do with their government. So we went through this laissez-faire economy. That was with the next president, Calvin Coolidge, where this president just kind of was like, I'm going to lay back. I'm just going to let the economy run its own. I'm not going to be in people's businesses. That's what the people want. I want them to love me and trust me. And that's what happened. And the economy flourished. It boomed. Everyone was working. Everyone had a job. People were getting raises. People were spending their money like crazy. Henry Ford around this time becomes really big because he mass produces automobiles for average Americans. The Model T was his very first vehicle that was used by the assembly line process, which was, now everything is made by the assembly line, but he was the first to do it with automobiles, which made it affordable for Americans. Charles Lindbergh becomes the first person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean solo by himself, and that was a major accomplishment for the United States. He made world news. And then we have all these cool, plus tons more of inventions and innovations that made life so much easier, but it got people spending lots of money they didn't have. So this new idea of buying on credit was introduced in the 1920s. And you just put a little down payment, and then you make installment plans, which are payment plans. That got people in a lot of debt. That caused a lot of problems. And at the end of the 1920s, we closed this really cool, fun decade, prosperous decade, with a crash that happened in 1929. October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday. And everything, we go through a Great Depression right after that. All right. So now we are on the topic of the Great Depression, which this one is even shorter. This PowerPoint is even shorter than the last one. All right, so the Great Depression was the entire 1930s. We went from a prosperous 1920s to the complete opposite in the 1930s. So to start off the decade, Herbert Hoover was president in 1929 when the crash happened. No one saw it coming, and everyone blamed it. Everyone blamed him because he didn't do enough to get Americans out of the Great Depression. Because the government wasn't involved with anyone, and they had to change all that, and that was something new that they didn't even know what to do, how to do it, like how to help Americans out financially, economically, and just and regulate the economy in general. It had never been done by the government. So here are the main causes of the Great Depression: overproduction. Right, we were producing way too much, even though people stopped buying because they were getting in too much debt towards the end of the 1920s. Buying on credit, people accumulated a lot of debt that they could not afford. They could not make their payments. They couldn't pay back businesses for all the stuff they took out, like in loans. And, those businesses lost money, and those businesses closed, fired people, and then shut down. And that's a huge contribution. Bad banking practices. Banks, they were investing people's money in the stock market, so depositors' money. So when stock market crashed, banks closed down because they lost people's money. And then people also cleared out the banks with these bank runs, where they were all rushing at one time to take out their money. Speculation, this is so important. Speculation is what caused the stock market to crash. People were just kind of guessing that prices were going to rise, so they're trying to put their money in while, stocks, shares were low to buy. And as they did that, the stock market rose. And then when it got to a really high point, they're like, it's going to crash. So they all took their money out, and they caused the stock market to crash. You can't do that at one time. So I already mentioned that it's October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday. Things were never the same after that. Trade also declined worldwide because we had really high tariffs, which is taxes on trade. And that backfired because other countries stopped buying our stuff. We stopped buying theirs, they stopped buying ours, and worldwide trade declined, as you can see at the beginning of this bar graph. And like I said, people are without a job. People become homeless. They start living in Hoovervilles, little shanty towns that they created, shacks on sides of the road in open land. People were getting food through charities in the forms of breadlines and soup kitchens. Farmers had it bad too, but their depression started in the 1920s. The Dust Bowl was in the 30s, but they were already struggling in the 1920s. So that was because of a series of dust storms, dry land, and just overcropping the land. They were continuously just using it, abusing it without really properly. And then these winds and the loose dirt, and it caused the Dust Bowl, just storms that actually reached all the way to the Northeast. So a lot of these farmers, which were the original homesteaders or their ancestors, they abandoned their lands. They were called Okies because they were from Oklahoma, most of them. And they went west looking for a job in farming. And in California, there were a lot of jobs in farming, but they were occupied by Mexican Americans. So President Hoover passed a law deporting Mexicans and Mexican Americans to Mexico just to free up the jobs for Okies. So it's the Mexican Repatriation Act. Hoover tried to save the economy by implementing all these public works projects like the Hoover Dam. It was cool, had great intentions, but it didn't create, that one along with a bunch of others, didn't create enough jobs to get Americans out. So Americans had enough after one term with Hoover, and they elect a new president, which is Franklin D. Roosevelt. He becomes the 32nd president, and he was elected up to 4 terms. He all throughout the 1930s and halfway through the 40s, because he was also president at the beginning of World War II, but he died during World War II. So his plan is the New Deal. He creates the New Deal, which is a series of laws, a series of reform, recovery, and forgot the other one, laws that are just kind of meant to improve the economy, prevent future issues like this from happening. And he creates tons of New Deal laws, but the only ones that I'm going to talk about are the ones in bold, because those are more important than the others, because they come out a lot. So the Tennessee Valley Authority, that one was to help the Tennessee Valley region, because it was a very underdeveloped region, and that area was hit hard with the Great Depression. So it provided electricity, just improved the area all around. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, to try to get Americans to be more trustworthy of banks and to put their money back in banks, because the economy can't flourish without banks being open and regulated. This gave Americans insurance, guaranteed insurance on their money that they put in the bank, but only up to $2,500. All right, so that's the max you can put in a bank at that time, because if they lose your money, then that $2,500, you're only going to get back $2,500. So that's Federal Deposit Insurance. You have insurance on your deposits corporation. The Federal Securities Act, or the SEC, or that created the SEC, and this is what monitors the stock market to prevent another crash. All right, so the Securities and Exchange. Securities means stocks. Exchanging, that happens on a daily basis. People are buying and selling, but it monitors the stock market. And then we have the Social Security Act. That's what provides benefits to different groups of people. The elderly, the disabled, anybody that doesn't make a lot of money, unemployed, retirees, single parents, children who don't have a father in their life. All these people can get a monthly check, and this is to take care of them. It started through the Great Depression, but it's still around today, Social Security. So those are the four main New Deal acts that you have to know for the STAAR. So make sure to go back and learn them, okay? FDR was on a roll, passing all these New Deal laws, and Congress was just approving them, approving them. And then the Supreme Court felt like he was kind of overstepping his authority and was passing some laws that were unconstitutional. So the judicial branch started to repeal some of those laws, and FDR was upset about that. They felt like he was just taking advantage of his authority. So he clashed a lot with the Supreme Court. So he tried to propose an idea of maybe getting rid of some people, anybody over 70, and even adding more judges, which I heard that they're going to do that. They're thinking of doing that again, like recently. That's like in the talks, that they're going to vote on maybe putting more judges on the Supreme Court, which means if that passes, then Biden gets to choose because it's the power of the president, gets to appoint more judges to the Supreme Court, and of course he's going to appoint more Democratic presidents, and therefore anything he gets, any laws that he passes will probably be supported by the judicial branch, and they won't overturn those laws. So that was first proposed by FDR, and people thought he was crazy. They thought he was a dictator. They're like, look at you, like trying to change the Constitution, change the government because you're not getting what you want. So that is that. And it didn't work. He couldn't get this idea approved, the court packing plan. And because of that, because of how he was abusing his power, it led to the 22nd Amendment, in which they put term limits on presidents, because he did 4 terms. And they were like, never again are we going to have a president in power for so long. So now it's just 2. And don't forget about Eleanor Roosevelt, the first lady, Roosevelt's wife, who was very involved in politics. She was his advisor. She was an advocate for women's rights. And, just things like that. I think she was also one of the main leaders of the United Nations because her husband created the United Nations. All right, that's it. So let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break. I know we have about 15 minutes left, but 5-minute break, or you can continue doing the matching. But I need to put together the dates so I can show you, so we can learn about that really quickly. And the dates will be easy. I'm just going to have it on a paper with the dates, and I'm just going to type out what they all are. All right, I am going to go ahead and get started on the dates. Do you guys have a sheet that you can write the dates down? Like a blank sheet or the back side of one of your papers? You can type it out if you want to. I'll help you learn it. You know what? I just realized. Hold on. What? No, you guys have 9. Yeah, but I need my 9 minutes. All types of stuff in there. No, it's okay. I see you falling asleep, and that's what reminded me that I was supposed to do right something. Okay, I will share this with you guys on Google Classroom. 1898, what is the significance of that? Oh, that's, yeah. Spanish, American, I'm just gonna leave it like this. And Hawaii. Oh no, I don't want it to go on to the next one. All right, cool. Next one, 1914. Yes, World War I begins. And this is during, yeah, US joins. I'm sorry, I'm going really fast. And I'll see your responses in the chat. You know what, I'll leave the chat open. Okay, 1918. Good. 1919. Treaty of Versailles is signed the year after. I'll go back and change it later. 1929. Good. Stock market crashes, right? Which is the beginning. GD begins. 1939 to 1945. Good. World War II. I should have, oh man, like divided that. All right, 1941. It is during World War II, so we join, right? So yeah, attack on Pearl Harbor, US joins. 1957, Cold War, Russia does something, sparks the space race. Good, Sputnik launched. Huh? I know. 1968, the end of the 1960s. The 60s was crazy. So in 68, Martin Luther King was assassinated. MLK Jr. assassinated. 1969, President JFK had promised to Americans that we would do something by the end of the decade. Okay, good. So Armstrong lands on moon. And then 1991, end of Cold War. Were you going to say that? Okay, good. 2001, good. The 9/11 terrorist attack. 2008. That's a good guess. That comes a little after, but Obama becomes president, first African-American president. Okay. Extra credit. These are others that you should know. I don't know if they'll be on your test. I don't know if you'll be asked about this event, about this year, but it's good to know. So 1932, it's at the beginning, during the beginning of the Great Depression. That's really close. That's a good guess. It's an election. Who becomes president during the Great Depression? After. Close, FDR. Yeah, FDR becomes president. Good try. I'm gonna go back up here. 1951 to 1953, whenever you see it like that, it means a war. A smaller one before that. Korean War. 1958, it's right after Sputnik, a year later. Has to do with the space race. They launched Sputnik, we responded by creating NASA. NASA created. 1961, it's a young president. Young person becomes president. JFK becomes president. And then 1975, end of Vietnam War, which that was like 65 to 75, about 10 years. Okay, told you that was quick. So I will share this with you guys so you can have it as a study guide, but make sure that you are going back to these quizzes and you're quizzing yourselves. You've got to learn them. All right, here are the dates now.